G20 host Brazilian President Lula da Silva says a tax on the super rich could be a way to level the playing field and tackle global challenges. And Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan warns that a famine in Gaza has reached catastrophic levels. Can the world's biggest economies tackle these issues? I'll break that down and more here on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. The world has moved on from U.S. President Joe Biden. Literally, global leaders at the G20 summit in Brazil didn't even wait for Biden to take the traditional family photo. The White House's response? The photo op was taken earlier than expected. But is there a hidden message behind this possible snub? While Biden was wandering through the Amazon, G20 host Brazilian President Lula da Silva railed against global inequality. He underlined the need for reform at major international organizations like the World Bank and the UN Security Council. One of his solutions, a 2% tax on the ultra-rich. He said that money could be spent tackling climate change and social unrest. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's main agenda was making a fairer world possible. He highlighted the catastrophic famine that's gripping Gaza and stressed that action is needed to stop Israel's atrocities. For more, joining me now from London is political analyst Javier Farje. From Shanghai, Xin Zhang, an associate professor at East China Normal University. And from St. Gallen, Switzerland, Guido Cozzi, the chair of macroeconomics at the University of St. Gallen. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. A very eventful G20 summit. I want to begin with you, Javier. You've been watching and closely following the summit. What are the major themes for you?
I believe that the major themes, the major element of this summit is basically the role that developing countries have been playing in the summit, especially Brazil, the host, in terms of prioritizing what the developing countries need instead of the priorities of the Western countries or the big economies like United States, United Kingdom, Italy, or France. I think that's crucial. And also the role that China is playing in all this. And what I mean, President Lula proposed a global alliance to fight poverty. And fighting poverty and hunger has become a key element in the final statement of the conference, of this summit. Secondly, the position that developing countries have in relation to Ukraine and Palestine has also had an important element, in this summit. There was no condemnation of Russia for the invasion, but there was a call for ending the war. And in the case of the Palestine, there was a repeat of the demand for a two-state solution, something which, as we know, Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to do. But the global fight on poverty is an element which has to be taken into account. And I believe that some of the Western, powers like United States, United Kingdom have played a lesser role in this summit than they used to play in the past. So I think that's very important because the developing world, of which China believes to be part of it, although by the size of its economy you may not consider it, but they are part of it in many ways. The role they are playing in this kind of summits, how much more relevant they are instead of just guests that they invite there just to fill up the numbers. I think for me, that is one of the major elements that we could consider as a success in many ways of this G20 summit in Brazil.
Should Javier is saying it's a changing of the guard at this G20 summit? We look at the family photo, Biden's missing, he's wandering around the Amazon. You see that these rising and developing nations are becoming more prominent. Is that the same read you're getting from Shanghai?
To some extent, yes. Obviously, I agree with the first speaker's comments that the agenda, particularly promoted by President Lula from Brazil, really has set a new agenda for G20 as an international organization. From the very early on, the G20 was in charge of microeconomic coordination among some of the most important, both developed and developing countries. I think over time, priority of the organization has gone already a set of changes a modification over time. But this time, I think we do see, particularly under the leadership of President Lula, the whole agenda, the priority of G20 has made a decisive shift to those issues like climate change, reform for international government and international governance, and especially poverty alleviation. So in that sense, I think the role of a developing country, or these days we call more and more global south, has played a much bigger role in it. But I wouldn't go too far to say this is again, a north versus south split or even confrontation within G20. I think that the mood is still to enhance the voices of developing country, give more weight to specific agendas that are of more interest to developing country or the global south, but demand for joint efforts, collaboration among all members of this important international organization. So far to see a, again, north-south division within G20.
Guido, inequality is one of the major themes at this summit. And President Lula says, that's easy, we can solve it. Tax the rich, strengthen the state. Now, generally, these are kind of left-wing socialist ideologies, but in the mainstream, can this be a solution to global inequality? Can this be a solution to combating climate change as well, according to what the Brazilian head of state has said?
Well, it would be too good to be true, actually, because the wealth, even though one can generate theoretically a couple of $100 billion dollars tax revenue, this is far less than one could need to alleviate inequality. And moreover, there are all sorts of implementation issues around this tax that even if all countries agreed to impose, it would be extremely difficult to implement. And also, it's not at all guaranteed that all countries may agree. The big elephant in the room is obviously the incoming president of the United States, who is not there, Donald Trump, I don't think he will endorse a wealth tax on the billionaires. And if in the hypothetical scenario that all the other countries, which is not at all guaranteed, that all the other countries agree on that, except the United States, that would be a big favor to the United States, because there would be a lot of migration of billionaires to the United States. So I'm not sure a tiny bit of taxation at the very top of the income and wealth quantiles will ever, alleviate poverty. I would focus on something more important, which is probably the presence of the African Union in the G20, which is the first time it is there, and they know what poverty is, and they probably can participate and collaborate in more productive versions of policies towards the alleviation of inequalities.
Javier, global governance reform, that's been another hot topic at the G20 summit. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he touched on this as well. He's actually been talking a lot about this since 2016, since his UNGA speech, but it seemed to become more mainstream now, many more countries embracing, yeah, it is time to reform the UN. It is time to reform the World Bank. It is time to reform other international institutions.
Yes.
How do you believe that the G20 summit and also the leaders at that summit and these other organizations, how are they going to go about doing this, especially when some of them have veto power to veto this giving power away?
That is the problem. The Security Council, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, do not represent the feelings of the General Assembly of the UN. We saw it in the vote about the situation in Palestine, for example, where the majority of the General Assembly voted condemning Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon, and yet the 5 member states would not exercise their veto power to prevent more death and more, more violence, in the occupied territories. So it depends how much pressure the General Assembly and the developing countries exercise in the UN, in different bodies of the UN, not the Security Council, because for as long as these 5 permanent members, that's going to be difficult. In different bodies of the United Nations to put pressure on changing this. And to add something small to what Guido said, just small, at the end of January, there was a meeting of finance ministers of the G20 in Brazil prior to the summit today and yesterday, and they disagreed about a global taxation on the 3,000 billionaires that are in the world at the moment. I just wanted to add that in relation to governance, that's going to be a problem. We mustn't forget that this is an anachronism. These 5 members that have veto power is an anachronism, some of which comes from the aftermath of the Second World War, some of it. So, however, since China has been playing a pivotal role in working with the developing countries in the BRICS, for example, or in the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and they are permanent members of the Security Council, they may contribute to change the way things are done and run globally. So this is extremely important. But again, Guido is always, my colleagues are always right. Of course, this is not a total change of the guard, but there is a shift. There's a small shift in the way things are going, and this could be could influence any attempts to change global governance at the UN level anyway, and different bodies of the UN.
Xin, are these changes in global governance, or this desire to change global governance, this changing of the guard that we're witnessing at this G20 summit, is this all triggered by a successful BRICS summit in Kazan? I mean, I was at the summit. I saw many countries there. Turkey becoming a partner country, being a NATO country, becoming a partner country of the BRICS. Very unique moment, obviously. Is the BRICS and its growing influence kind of driving these older institutions to take these reforms to make themselves more relevant once again?
Yeah, I would agree with your major point that the BRICS is a part of this global process where the existing institutions of global governance, including UN, but go beyond just the United Nations. These existing institutions, some of them are outdated, some of them, its function leaves a lot to be desired, leave a lot of loopholes. Demands for quality governance was not met by the existing institutions. So for various reasons, the demand for change or reform of global governance has now become more and more a consensus across board, across many different countries. So BRICS, as one relatively recent and somewhat unique multilateral organization, is one of the examples of alternative institutions that may play a complementary role to these existing institutions. But of course, the reform is not going to be easy. We've seen multiple supposedly complementary institutions somewhat get into competition with each other, and also there is significant overlap between these relatively new institutions with the existing institution in terms of their agenda, functions, sphere of expertise, etc. So how to delineate the partnership, delineate the working relation between these existing institutions and the new institutions, I think the picture is far from clear. For example, our other colleagues just mentioned the possibility of a reform of United Nations Security Council. I'm personally fully endorse that basic idea. But given the fact that countries like Russia is on the Security Council, and also United States is also on the Security Council permanent member, and not all these existing major powers on the Security Council permanent membership has agreed to reform the Security Council setup, especially by giving more powers to the General Assembly, right? So I think these existing major players who hold a pivotal power in the current global governance structures haven't reached a clear consensus how much power, decision-making, resources need to be relocated to these new type of international systems. So I think the general picture, change are in the making, but the whole picture is far from clear.
Guido, I asked Xin earlier about Biden being missed in the family photo. Now, I've been to a lot of these summits, and obviously all these leaders have their teams, and it's quite hard to miss something like a traditional family photo. So I'm assuming that the other leaders in the photo all noticed Biden was missing. Now, was this a snub? Was this a signal to Donald Trump, the incoming president-elect? Was this, what was it? What was it? Because it was weird. It really caught my eye, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Well, clearly also it struck me, of course, there could be a delay, the reason, but symbolically, what I'm wondering, does it represent the absence of Biden because, Trump is taking over and therefore his policies will be less compelling, his commitments, or is it the absence of the United States? In general, this is the big question. Will the United States be able to retake a major role in the G20, or would it not? Would maybe the BRICS countries take an expanding role alongside their macroeconomic evolution? Because actually the big movements, the geological movements, we could say, are related to growth. And according to the OECD predictions, in a quarter century, the real GDP of China will match that of the United States plus Europe combined. And the GDP of India will match that of the United States. So the United States and Europe are becoming less important in terms of GDP. So there is some, if one takes a forward-looking picture of, of this picture, we could say kind of reflects the rebalancing in the macro economies of our children.
Mm-hmm. Javier, the famine in Gaza, this was also another important point. Many of the leaders touched upon Gaza. The Turkish president really highlighted it as well in his comments. What can G20 countries do, and how many G20 countries are actually going to support a joint initiative on Gaza?
The problem here is that the main allies of Israel, United States, United Kingdom, etc., for as long as they keep on supplying weapons to Israel, whatever calls to stop the massacres, because that's the only way you can describe what's happening in Gaza and parts of Lebanon, if they continue supplying weapons to Israel, Israel will continue acting the way they're acting. Second, for as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel, any solution to the problem is going to be very, very difficult to achieve. So it is in the hands of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the countries that have been supporting Israel with weapons to stop the supply of weapons, which enables Israel to do what they are doing. They can sign their statement at the end of the G20 saying we are in favor of the two-state solution. We want more humanitarian aid. We should stop killing civilians. That will mean absolutely nothing. That wet paper, as we say in Latin America, is if something concrete, which is stopping the supply of weapons to Israel, doesn't happen. For as long as that happens, no solution will be any near. And the suffering will continue. And don't forget that some people in Israel are already talking about taking over Gaza. So it has to be the main allies of Israel which will have to do something about that. Otherwise, nothing is going to happen. I'm afraid that the pressure that developing countries could make, and it's been a lot of pressure, I mentioned the vote in the General Assembly in relation to what's happening there, will mean very little as long as the allies of Israel continue helping that country with weapons and ammunition.
Xin, as Javier just mentioned, it looks like Israel has plans to annex Gaza, quite possibly the West Bank. Maybe this could even be expanded to conquering southern Lebanon and territories from Lebanon. What can the G20 do? Can they do anything? Can the UN do anything? Let's broaden this out and not just talk about the G20. Can there be a global response that could stop this, or are we now entering some age of conquest type of mentality for the global community?
Well, currently I'm maybe pessimistic on a concrete solution, especially from an international platform like a G20, other than issuing some statement criticizing Israel's behavior, or to go through some lengthy discussion whether these actions are genocide or not. I don't see any concrete, immediate solution or action plan from G20 or in some other similar regional or international organization. Unless, given the context in Gaza, in that part of the world, unless some external actors with the sufficient means of coercion are willing to take the risks to intervene upfront, I don't see Israel in the position to stop these action anytime soon, right? So I'm not being very pessimistic on that. We see some encouraging message from leaders during the G20 summit. Chinese leaders also raised both the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza simultaneously in his speech, and strongly demand for international joint efforts to seek for peace. Again, that's a very encouraging message from the Chinese top leader. But I think we're really short of concrete means to achieve this peaceful deal for either the Ukrainian war or the essentially military conflicts in Gaza.
Guido, another international issue, a little lower on the agenda, it seems, in Brazil at the G20 summit is the war in Ukraine. But when we look at the news, especially what's been happening the past couple hours, it seems that the U.S. has given permission to Ukraine to use long-range missiles. There's been reports that the first long-range missiles may have even been launched. Russian President Vladimir Putin has reorganized, let's say, the Russian nuclear doctrine for quicker retaliation strikes against Ukraine if these weapons are used. Where is the G20 on this issue? Because when I look at the rhetoric and the declaration, the war in Ukraine is really only mentioned once, but it seems that it's tremendously heating up.
It is also because it is again the end of Biden's mandate, and Biden started his mandate with his famous Munich speech about democracies versus autocracies. And he has a strong ideological position that doesn't favor negotiations. On the other side, Donald Trump seems to favor a more transactional approach, a more negotiation approach. So presumably the situation will may cool down, and you know, in this Cold War scenario, we have been seeing more and more under Biden's administration will hopefully calm down, and the relationships with the non-democracies will you know, become more take more transactional and business-oriented approach, and this also involves China, which is obviously threatened by the tariffs proposed by you know, promised by Trump, but maybe the end of this Cold War situation may facilitate even you know, the global economy. But this transition period is highly turbulent. So hopefully it doesn't escalate at the last minute.
Javier, I didn't know if I wanted to ask this question or not, but when Guido first mentioned in his answer that it's the end of Biden's mandate, I decided to ask it. Now, with Biden outgoing, Trump incoming, a new mandate, a mandate around diplomacy with the Russians, a mandate around peace in Ukraine. Is Biden letting U.S. domestic politics play a role in his foreign policy decisions on Ukraine?
From the time Clinton said once that every time there's an election, domestic politics play a more important role than international politics. People will not vote for which candidate, this candidate or the candidate because of Gaza or Ukraine. They will vote about the economy and all that, which is the reason why Donald Trump won. On the other hand, and this is extremely important, I don't think it's been highlighted enough. After President-elect Trump spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine with Elon Musk there, President Zelensky said a few days later that he believed that under Trump, it is possible to end the war. Now, this is, if you see all the statements that President Zelensky has been doing in the last at least year, this is the most optimistic. He believes that under President Trump, he there will be an end of this war. Now, on what basis he said that, we don't know, but it's a quite an optimistic assessment from the main victim of this invasion. Now, whether President Trump is going to put pressure on Russia, with whom he has a good relationship, that might be a crucial element in this. It would be totally ironic and not a bad news anyway if President Trump manages to end the war in Ukraine.
Javier, Xin, Guido, thank you for sharing your insight with our viewers. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.